All right, thank you for joining us to talk about comprehensive assessment systems today. This is going to be the 101 session on building a comprehensive assessment system, or maybe more accurately on taking what you've already built, because every district has something that they've built before, and just sort of cleaning it up, making sure that you've covered all the bases and that you haven't over covered some of those bases. So it's a topic I'm pretty excited about because I think the biggest piece about getting this system right is it starts to calm the waters that are kind of rough in some districts about over testing, that we're over testing kids. We're hearing it from parents, we're hearing it from students, teachers, even in some cases, and the community. So this could be the solution to some of those issues for you in your district if that's something that you're dealing with. In this session, we are going to cover a few different topics. What is a comprehensive assessment system? Sort of defining it. The basic assessment system, and that's really the components that make up a basic assessment system. Comprehensive assessment systems to support MTSS. So what are those additional elements that get added into your system when you put an MTSS lens over an assessment system? And then we're going to give you 6 practical steps for building a system in your district. And again, when we say building, we really mean refining what you've already built. And then if there are any questions, we'll take some questions. So what is a comprehensive assessment system? This is the definition that we have landed on. And I will say this definition and all definitions throughout this presentation are all debatable in some ways. School districts define things in many different ways. The way we're defining them, if it differs from the way you defined it in a school district, doesn't make your definition wrong. But because this is such a gray area for school districts in these definitions, we wanted to make sure that we landed the plane and came up with a definition for each component of the system and for the system itself. And we would strongly recommend that you and your district have those conversations and land your own planes on those definitions. So we'll start out with our definition of a comprehensive assessment system. It's a system of assessment tools varying in purpose that promote the careful selection of the right assessments at the right time to provide the right information to inform next steps. So notice we use the word tools instead of just the word tests, so not just a system of tests. It's balanced in the sense that it offers the correct level of different kinds of information. So sometimes I think about that as having enough information and maybe not too much. And it's comprehensive in the sense that it integrates different assessment types to appropriately serve all students and their needs. So making sure you have all the types of assessment needed to make sure you cover the base in terms of the needs of all students. There we go. Every student has a unique learning journey. We need to make sure that the assessments that we are using to find each of those decision points in the path of a student that will appropriately allow us to make that next best step for kids. So I always think of the learning journey for each student as being a choose your own adventure book, where there are decision points all throughout, and that each student maybe takes a different and unique path on their way. Educators need the right tools to be able to measure, monitor, and verify each student's learning in those, not only the decision points, but as a student is navigating their learning journey. So these are the big questions that assessments can answer for a school district. This is just a sampling. We probably could have 1,000 different questions on the screen, but here are some big ones. What do students know, and what do they not yet know? And it's really important, I think, and very purposeful in putting the word yet in there. And I love that I've seen this practice take place in a lot of different school districts. Learning is not a destination, it really is a process. And so I like implanting the word yet into that sentence. And of course, this really addresses question number 2 of DeFore's 4 questions. Question number 1, what do we want all students to know and be able to do? But then we need to know, what do they know and what don't they know? And that's where assessment comes in. So another question, where are students struggling, and more importantly, why? Or I shouldn't say more, but just as importantly, why? Why are students struggling in a certain area? That's where diagnostic reporting and diagnosing students comes into play. If we don't address the root cause or even identify the root cause for why students aren't learning, a lot of times we spend a lot of money, time, and energy spent trying to support students in a way that they didn't really need because we didn't address the root cause. And what should I teach next? What should I adjust in future lessons? So it's giving us that information from testing, and truthfully, a lot of it isn't just the testing, but it's strong reporting coming out of that testing. Which students need an intervention? Which intervention matches the need? And again, that's a more focused version of question number 2 up here. If students need something beyond Tier 1 instruction, and we always go to Tier 1 and strengthening that first, but if students need something beyond, what do they need? And how do we find the right intervention for students? Does retained learning meet district and state expectations? This is a great question. This is one that I think everybody struggles with. They struggle with sort of this prediction idea. Is what we're doing predictive of where students will land on state testing? I think school districts, because they're desperate just for that information, have sort of gotten stuck there a little bit. We want to make sure we move beyond the prediction to disrupting those predictions, so that we can make sure that their learning really is going to meet the expectations for the state testing and beyond, and really beyond state testing to lifelong learning. Does our curriculum have gaps between learning expectations and assessments? It's a great question. How are you going to know if there are gaps? Sometimes and I would say this practice is really dying out, but we said, we covered it, why didn't they learn it? So covering it is always up for debate. This will let you know that covering it really needs to equate to whether the students learned it or not. So addressing this question is going to be about finding exactly the ways in which maybe students have been underserved by the instruction and ways we can refine instruction to meet their needs. So a comprehensive assessment system provides a complete set of tools needed to help each educator take the best next step to support each student's learning journey. So it's a comprehensive set of tools, not just a complete list of tests. So let's get into the basics of an assessment system and starting to define some of the terminology from within. So I can't say it enough times that this is all a gray area. Districts define things in different ways, and that's not wrong. We just want to make sure that for the purpose of this, we're sort of landing on the words we are going to assign to different purposes of assessment. So let's start with just the basics, just-in-time short cycle assessments. So in other words, what some people put into the bucket called formative assessments. And we are really going to refine that a little bit further throughout this presentation and what we mean by that. Interim assessments, so those seasonal periodic assessments are the second bucket. And then summative being sort of end of learning or evaluative assessments. We're going to dig into each of those. So just-in-time short cycle assessments or formative assessments. These are here really to provide data to inform the instruction that follows. And at its best, that means the instruction that follows with students in the room. You're evaluating data and going through that together. It should happen with all students, and we say all students purposefully because every student should be receiving not only Tier 1 instruction and has the right to receive all of those grade level standards, even if in an adaptive form for some students. But that means that all students should also be participating in a formative assessment process within that Tier 1 instruction. And it should be happening in an ongoing and continuous way. This really is, at its best, woven into and a part of the instruction itself. So some examples might be quick quizzes, some pre-planned common assessments that maybe a PLC has constructed together or a teacher has constructed ahead of time, discussions, observations, comprehension checks, entrance and exit tickets, and some tools that provide some of those are there are some assessment platforms out there with item banks, including Inspect Plus, along with DNA, which is a place where you can display that data, or other platforms. Many other platforms contain formative assessment questions that you can use. Otherwise, sometimes it's formative assessment methodology. People like Dylan Williams has built a career on formative assessment strategies for the classroom. Interim assessments. So the purpose of interims is to really measure standards proficiency for students, but in more of a periodic, seasonal, dipstick check kind of way. So this is can also have some formative qualities, and we're going to talk more about the formative qualities of interims, but it's a less frequent seasonal assessment that you're giving kids to really check the health of the standards health of students, classrooms, sites, and districts. So they are standards aligned common assessments that are administered, and in most cases common. That depends on the size of your district. Sometimes there's only one algebra class, and so you're giving one fall algebra interim assessment, for example. And then a lot of times your curricular resources have some vendor provided interim assessments already created for districts. And then again, there are other item-based platforms out there that come with pre-built interim assessments in them. So we listed Inspect Plus there as one example of that. Then summative assessments. Summative assessments are really about evaluating and certifying the learning that happens, again, in a periodic or seasonal way, or just really at the end of a unit of study, which in some cases comes at the end of the year, the end of a course, or in some cases just, again, the end of a period of learning for a student. It's meant, the big thing that signifies it isn't as much the frequency as it is the fact that you are evaluating or certifying learning, and that's the major purpose of the assessment. All students take summative assessments. And some examples, of course, the ultimate example is the state standards assessment that happens at the end of the year or in April or May for most districts in most states. They are standards aligned common assessments. So sometimes they are created in district, or sometimes they are provided again by the vendor of your curricular resources. And it could include things like Inspect Plus or just classroom summative assessments created by teachers or by PLCs. So here are some common areas of confusion, and I will tell you there are many in the world of a balanced assessment system. So we wanted to sort of give our stance at Illuminate on these for the purpose of sort of, here's the foundation we're going to build the rest of the presentation and balanced assessment system on. So first is that districts really do use assessments differently, and that is okay. We just want to make sure that we're using a tool suited to the purpose and the task at hand. So people get too caught up in titles and names sometimes. The truth is, assessments are determined really by their purpose more than by their specific name. So we want to make sure that in a balanced assessment system, we're covering that full spectrum of purposes that we need assessments to serve in order to answer all the questions we have, including the questions we started this presentation with. And then the second point here, assessment is a process that's fueled by assessment tools. So it's really the process piece. And this is a shift, I will say, in the way this has been commonly understood for a lot of districts. It isn't necessarily the tool, but it's the process that we use. So it's focusing more on the verb. It's that process piece versus the noun, the title of the assessment or the name of the assessment. So formative assessment specifically is a process, and we want to make sure we clearly define it that way. It provides the feedback and then this cycle of ongoing teaching and learning so that we are moving students along that learning progression. So it's the things that they haven't learned yet. Yet is really important. We want to keep that process moving forward. So just-in-time short cycle assessments are tools used in that process, but it's all about that interaction between the teacher, the students, and the data that's used to fuel and refine that interaction over time. And then summative assessment is also a process, but it's a process of evaluating or certifying learning at the end of a specific period of instruction. So we don't like to define summative assessment just as a state assessment. It's anytime you're sort of sticking a pin in learning just to see where students are at, you're evaluating and certifying that learning and saying this is where they landed. Summative assessments are the tools in that process and used in that process. And an assessment can be both formative and summative and have formative and summative qualities. I really am a strong believer that every assessment had better have some formative qualities to it, in that data better be used to inform refinement in the future at some level, including state data. State data just may not be the data that teachers are using formatively, and frankly, that's nearly impossible. It doesn't give refined enough data to use in a formative way very well for a teacher. But what it can do is it can be formative at a district or a state level. in terms of the PD they're providing around a certain strand that is weak within a certain grade level or content area. So this is the process and sort of the ends of the spectrum. Assessment of learning is really about evaluating or certifying learning of students. So it's meant for evaluation. It's to determine status or grades, or some of those metrics that we often assign to students come from summative assessment, which is sort of ironic because it's the other types of assessments that move them to that point where we can certify their learning or determine the grade. So assessment for learning includes assessment used for the purpose of giving teachers feedback so they know how to guide their instruction going forward, or know how to refine their instruction based on the guidance the assessment's giving them. So it's about responding to student need. This is sort of where it used to end, but now we've moved over to assessment as learning or assessment is learning. This is the process in the moment with students where you're providing feedback and the students are self-assessing, thinking about their thinking with metacognition. And it's a sort of dance between students and teachers and between the content and the students and teachers, going back and forth in this ever sort of evolving process in the classroom. So here are some examples of formative and summative qualities. So let's talk about the formative and summative qualities of each of these. Entrance and exit tickets. Those have become, I would say exit tickets for a while became the hottest topic in education. Everybody was giving exit tickets, which is a really good practice. The only thing about exit tickets is that it requires teachers to have to analyze data from the end of the class that day to when students walk in the next day so they can use that data in a differentiated way. That definitely could fall into the category of formative assessment, but we are encouraging districts to think about adding in the practice of entrance tickets. So when students walk in the room, let's collect data from those students about their learning, and then let's respond to that data in the moment with students in a process with the person who is best able to address any learning issues that students have or places where students are getting stuck. So entrance tickets really takes you all the way to the end of the spectrum of being formative. So it's formative in that we're checking for students' understanding and then responding right there in the day or the next day based on the data we gathered the day before. So it really is, it's slightly summative in that you are measuring mastery of a particular concept. It's just that it's not something that we grade, and it's something that we hope to keep moving from into better and better learning for students through the formative process. So end of unit tests, an example might be a Friday spelling test is an example of another moving down the spectrum, a little bit more summative, but also with formative qualities. So you're seeing summative appear first here. So it's a measure of the mastery of small chunks of content and assigned grades. So we're just calling this sort of ends of, some people call it ends of units of learning or something like that, but end of unit test. And then they should also be formative in that it's showing students what they've mastered and how they might want to refine the way in which they're learning, as well as refining for teachers the way in which they're teaching. So it's really important that we think of formative qualities as applying to teachers as well as students. I'm sorry, students as well as teachers, but both should be thinking about data in a formative way. Interim assessments, those periodic 2 to 3 times per year assessments. Now we're getting closer to a more summative assessment because it's measuring a larger chunk of learning. So that means that it's more difficult to use that in a formative way because there's so much contained within a whole fall or winter or spring assessment. But it should be formative. There should be reteaching that is guided after that. It's just a little less differentiated reteaching because you have a bigger chunk of data. And so for a teacher to go back and look at that data and decide on reteaching makes very good sense. But it also should really be formative at a leadership level and in terms of providing PD for teachers based on trends that people at the district level are analyzing and seeing across grade levels or across content areas. So because it's a little bit bigger, it's harder to turn a barge than it is a tugboat. And by the time we've gone through a whole period of learning, we have a little bit of a barge. Absolutely serves its purpose in a school district, though. You need to have those across district dipstick tests of the standards health so that you at the district or leadership level or even at a PLC level can really decide what we need to do next to address some bigger issues. And sometimes it's formative in that it's used the following year. That data is used the following year to help guide the creation of units of study based on weaknesses that they saw the year before. And then the all the way at the end of the spectrum is really completely summative. And when we say that, it still has some formative qualities, but those state assessments at a district level aren't particularly formative and don't have a lot of formative qualities to them. They really are meant to measure the mastery of the content and to make evaluations and determinations about students, about teachers, about sites, and about district level. So I think far too many districts focus on that state assessment to build the year of learning out, when really it's all of the other assessments previous that help determine where you're going to land at the end of that state assessment. Now, there are some formative qualities to a state assessment in that it can inform high level, strand level data about curriculum pacing and PD decisions. So what do we add into the system when we're talking about really building out MTSS, so multi-tiered system of supports for districts? So you'll notice we have the just-in-time short cycle assessments, we have the interim assessments, we have the summative assessments, but now we've thrown in 3 other categories here. So universal screening and benchmarking, and we're going to really pull the details out of these in the following slides. But the 3 big pieces are universal screening and benchmarking, skills analysis and diagnostics, and progress monitoring. So let's look at universal screening. The purpose is really, and again, I'm going to say it for the maybe 13th time during this presentation. These are generalized bucketed definitions that we're putting these into for the purpose of clarity. We could make this definition much longer about purpose, about who the students are, all those things, but we want to just keep it nice and clean and simple. And I think that's something we need to start to introduce into schools and balanced assessment systems is let's start simple. We can add nuance later. So universal screening and benchmarking's main purpose is to identify students who are at risk or may need additional assistance in order to meet their learning goals. So it's really about identifying who has Tier 1 instruction really worked well for and who maybe is at risk in some way or needs some additional assistance. It's for all students, thus the word universal, and the word screening implies, to find those that are at risk. Universal implies that it's for all students. So that doesn't mean you would use exactly the same universal screener for your 3rd grade students that you would use for your 11th grade students. But the point is that it's applied to, if this is about math at 3rd grade, it's applied to all 3rd grade students to identify those who might have additional needs in math. It happens at the beginning of the year and really periodically throughout the rest of the year. And again, it's sort of a seasonal assessment, much like interims, although for a very different purpose. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Some examples are NWEA MAP, STAR, FAST computer adaptive testing as one component of FAST. There are others, and then PALS are some examples of some universal screeners that districts use. So really importantly it's not just important that we figure out who needs additional assistance, but the second bucket here of these 3 is skills analysis and diagnostic. This is important because now we know who maybe needs additional assistance. This tells us sort of what kind of assistance they might need. So it's to pinpoint a specific area of learning need. Instead of just saying we have students who are not doing well in 3rd grade math, it's important to know that this specific group, targeted group, you'll hear the word targeted a lot, targeted group of students has a specific need in the area of calculation, for example. That's what diagnostic reporting and diagnostic assessment is meant to do. A really good universal screener provides you usually some high-level diagnostic reporting that gives you a little bit more of a clue if a student isn't doing well or they're below a certain national percentile rank. What area do they most have a need in? So it's given to students who are flagged by universal screening. That's who we want to really dig into diagnostic reporting and skills analysis for. And it's always done as a follow-up to universal screening. And it can come in the form of reporting that comes out of universal screening, or they can actually be additional tests that you use after screening to identify the actual area of need. So there's some reports within NWEA MAP, some reports within FastBridge, and then you have actual outside diagnostic assessments like the DAR. Then progress monitoring. So this is really a progression here. We've screened our students. We've determined who is moving along swimmingly with just Tier 1 instruction. And then we've identified those for whom they may need something beyond and in addition to Tier 1 instruction. So this diagnostic step is all about identifying what do they need beyond Tier 1 instruction, what specific area of need do they have. And then once we provide that, then we go to progress monitoring. So it's really meant, and we get really crazy definitions of progress monitoring. It's a pretty simple idea though. Progress monitoring is there to determine if the intervention we're providing students has been effective or not. So it's those really frequent weekly, or in some cases bi-weekly, assessment of students to see if the intervention that they're in is effectively filling the skill gap that those students have been identified as having. So some people push back and say progress monitoring is too frequent. We only progress monitor once a month or once every 2 months. That's not really progress monitoring. So I ask those districts, how effective do you feel like your interventions are with your students? How aligned are they to the students' need? If they're well aligned, that means that students should be making growth that's measurable in some way, potentially every week, bi-weekly, and for sure by 6 weeks, you should be seeing that intervention being effective with students if it's targeted at the right need. And that's why we do changes of intervention. Sometimes we're not seeing that it is being effective, and so that means a change in intervention might be needed. And then some examples of some progress monitoring assessments: Ames Web, STAR has some, and then FastBridge CBMs, curriculum-based measurements in FastBridge. So here's the big process in the flow, and it's, I think in many cases, districts have broken it down into its pieces, but haven't necessarily gotten a smooth flow moving for their students. And partially because data lives in silos, and sometimes it's hard to get that flow going and for people to see that flow. But it starts out with, and we're talking about the flow within MTSS. So we have students who are, again, receiving formative assessments. They're receiving great Tier 1 instruction. They're getting interim assessments. They're getting summative assessments. So this is happening alongside that. So universal screening of all students to identify who's at risk. Once we identify who's at risk, for those students, doing a skills analysis or diagnostic to figure out which area of need do they really have that put them at risk. Then placing them in a targeted intervention, and it's targeted at the need that was identified through diagnostic reporting or diagnostic assessments. Putting them in an intervention, hoping that it's aligned to the need. That was the purpose of the diagnostics. And then progress monitoring to make sure the intervention we put them in is one that's effectively filling that skill gap for students. So really tracking whether that intervention is working or not. And is working or is not working. And if not working, that's when you would change an intervention. And then we evaluate. So we periodically are checking to make sure that, and I will say this evaluation process really kind of happens all along and through progress monitoring. A piece that I'm glad that we called out here is that the fade out. Sometimes we put students in interventions and it becomes a little bit more of a label on a student than a label on the service that they're being provided. So they're called a Tier 2 or a Tier 3 student, and that's where they stay, and that label sticks with students, which I will say truthfully does eventually affect the identity of those students. So it's important that it isn't about labeling the student, that it's about evaluating the effectiveness of the interventions we're giving students, and that if we're doing this quote unquote right, then at some point you should be evaluating and looking for skill gaps being filled and fading students out of an intervention. So in some cases you have to change the intervention or continue the intervention, and the adjustment could be a less intensive or a more intensive, but at some point, if we are targeting our interventions appropriately, there should be a fade out. We should be filling the skill gap. If not, that's when you get in this situation when you keep adjusting interventions at the skill gap and it's being ineffective. That's when eventually at some point some students are considered for a special ed evaluation. In most cases, that's not where this process should end though. In most cases, it should end with student skill gaps being filled if they don't have a specific learning disability and moving them back into Tier 1 instruction exclusively. So let's look at this visually for a moment. All of these assessments that get pulled into an MTSS balanced assessment system and comprehensive balanced assessment system, All of these assessments we want to lay out visually so you can sort of see how frequently, where do they fall, for which students, in which areas. So let's look first here, Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. We're all used to this graphic. One thing I want to point out though, sometimes even though we all know this, it's important to note this Tier 1 instruction should be happening over all 3 tiers of these students, except in some really rare cases with Tier 3. But typically you want the students that are in receiving Tier 2 services and Tier 3 services to also be receiving Tier 1. And then we are pointing out here that the balanced assessment system is within the arenas of academic behavior and SEL. It is not just within the academic arena. So over here from fall to winter to spring, this is meant to represent a school year. We're going to talk about each kind of assessment and where and when they happen. So short cycle formative assessments are ongoing assessments. They should be happening all throughout the year in a continuous way for all students. Interim assessments, so those checks of a student's proficiency within benchmarks that happen, within standards that happen periodically. So interim assessments, again, just to reiterate, those are to check the standards health of students throughout the fall, the winter, and spring. So it's the dipstick checks on standards that students need to be proficient in. So those happen periodically. Typically 3 times, although for some districts they happen more frequently. Again, there are rare cases where there are some students in this Tier 3 situation who may not be participating in those interim assessments. The only reason that would be is because there's such a learning gap between where they're at and the standards for their grade level that it doesn't allow them to be able to even access those standards in any way. So that's what Tier 3 interventions are for. But in most cases, it's for all students. And then summative, same situation. This would happen at the end of a year or end of a term or course. So it follows sort of the same rules as an interim assessment would. Universal screening then, again, it's implied in the word universal, but you'll notice universal screening is for all. So all students should be screened universally. And that's sometimes called benchmarking, where you're applying a universal screener 3 times per year, and you're using it really to measure growth of students over time. And then diagnostic assessments. After universal screening, you really want to look at diagnostic reporting and diagnostic assessments to make sure that students who are not where they need to be and have skill gaps, that we're really identifying where those skill gaps are. So you'll notice diagnostics really, you don't see them appearing here with Tier 1 because those students are moving along with Tier 1 instruction. Diagnostic is about identifying skill gaps for students for whom Tier 1 hasn't been totally effective. And so that's what, and those that might need additional assistance. We see those with Tier 2 and Tier 3. And then progress monitoring goes along with the diagnostics. So for students who are identified as having a need in Tier 2 or Tier 3, we want to very frequently be progress monitoring. So we say weekly, in some cases bi-weekly. But this is the point, all of this data, and I think the reason districts struggle with getting a balanced assessment system put together is that all of the data needs to lead back to a student in some form. You need to be able to see that full spectrum of assessment data for a student at a given time. Academic data, behavioral, SEL data, diagnostic data, if you have it, screening data, interim data needs to come back together because they all serve a very different purpose. So I always think of this as in a district as being sort of a piece of fabric where the rows are the types of assessments and their purposes and the columns are the students. When you look down one of those columns, you need to be able to see all of those rows of data for a given student. And it's sort of weaving that fabric and finding a platform that will allow that fabric to come together is key in making sure that we're serving students well. And so rather than put the onus on teachers and leaders, we need to start to find a system that will pull that data together and make this manageable for districts. So here are a few FAQs about assessment. So if you look here, you will notice we have a picture of a road and we have a picture of a road that's not easy to travel that smoothly. So one with potholes in it. So I like to think about standards as being that road that a student's traveling down. So it's the learning goals expected of a learner by the end of a given grade or grade range or area of study. So imagine this being, again, we'll go back to the example I used earlier, your 3rd grade math standards. By the time that year is over, That is the road students have traveled down. They may have wavered left and right. They may have gone slower in some portions and faster in others, but by the end of the year, we want them to be relatively proficient in every one of those standards from within their grade level. So we want them to reach the end of the road, regardless of their pace or the exact path they took to get there. We want them to reach the end of that road. For some students, though, they have skills that they may be missing. So I think about the skills as the foundation under the road. So those are the abilities needed to use one's knowledge effectively and readily in execution or performance. So those are the skills needed really to go ahead and access the standards that are on that road. So if that's the foundation under the road, when you're missing enough of those skills or a student's missing enough of those holes, it really does create sort of these potholes in the road for a student, and they aren't able to successfully navigate. So interim assessments are really meant to see each student and are all students moving along that road effectively. Universal screening is meant to identify who really needs something more because there's some skills that underpin those standards that they're missing. And so I think about this as interim assessments, and this is really more about universal screening and identifying where those holes might lie for a student. So measuring standards of skills, and this has appeared on the last few slides, which you may or may not have noticed. So the blue here, the assessments that are for all students happening in Tier 1 instruction are all about measuring standards. That is the job of Tier 1 instruction. It's to make sure students are successfully navigating and becoming proficient in their standards for their grade level or their content area. This other part of the system that we sometimes call the additional MTSS assessments, those are meant to really identify the skills that might be missing for a student underneath their grade level standards road. So I think distinguishing this in a school district really helps clear a lot up for people, and it stops people from saying we're over testing. Why are we giving a map test and we're giving an interim test? Or why are we giving fast bridge progress monitoring when we're already doing short cycle formative assessments? So this graphic, I think, helps squelch the argument that we are assessing too much, which isn't to say that some districts are assessing too much. Some may be, but you want to make sure that each of these purposes is covered in the school district. So the difference again between interims and universal screening and benchmarking. And I will say again, some districts use the term benchmarks or interims interchangeably. But you should have both purposes being served in a school district that we are going to define in this way. So interim assessments, dipstick test of standards in your school district. Universal screening, dipstick test to measure risk for students about who doesn't have the skills they need to readily access those standards. So what do they have in common? And what maybe don't they have in common? So again, you'll notice here, interim assessments, universal screeners that you're using to benchmark, they are all to be administered to all, and usually periodically 2 to 3 times per year. Some districts go up to 5 times per year. We really recommend 3. Some go down as low as 2. Some people are calling all of these the same thing, but we're going to kind of start to distinguish them a little bit more for today. So interims are there to measure standards. Each student is receiving the same items typically on an interim, and which allows you to do some criterion referencing. At its best, interims are criterion referenced, have criterion reference reporting, and that you're really identifying where are the gaps in terms of standards for students. So this is about their standards proficiency, measuring them against a standard is the criterion reference portion. And then universal screening that sometimes we use for benchmarking is all about measuring the skills. They tend to be computer adaptive, although not in all cases, and particularly for your very young primary students, they may not be a computer adaptive assessment. But they tend to be computer adaptive, which means each student would receive a different set of items because the item they receive is based on the response to the previous item. So if it's one that they got wrong, it might move them to a lower level or a higher level, eventually honing in on their particular grade level. I will say interims typically also fall within grade level standards. Universal screenings can be measuring skills outside of grade level. In fact, they need to adequately do their job. And these typically result in norm referenced reporting. So measuring students against other students in that subject area during that season across the nation. That's why you usually get a national percentile rank as a score for universal screeners. So these are about measuring progress towards end of year proficiency, and universal screener is really about measuring risk. So there's a little confusion here because sometimes we use universal screeners to benchmark, but benchmark is sort of about determining where that student is at relative to the end of the year, and the purpose of a universal screener is really to measure risk. So interims and universal screeners, they are the actual assessments. The interims are the assessments, universal screeners are the actual assessments, and then benchmarks are those cut points. So those cut points that determine what we're going to call high risk or we're going to call low risk, for example. The important thing is that we're using the tool that's structurally appropriate to the task at hand, and that we have tools to address all of those tasks that we have to address for students. So comprehensive meaning, do you have the tools you need to really address all of the purposes of assessment in your school district? So here are some steps, and we've included some templates here for you to use in your district if you'd like to. You will be receiving a follow-up to this presentation that will include the presentation itself, and then we will eventually be getting you a toolkit of resources that will include some of these templates that you'll see on the following slides. So let's talk about 6 easy steps for building a comprehensive assessment system. And when I say easy, I really mean more clear and simple. Easy, nothing's easy when it comes to change being made in school districts, but we're hoping this can help guide you and make it a little bit easier for you in your district. So step number 1, and this is a step a lot of districts skip, create leadership teams if you don't already have them, and almost every district has these leadership teams. So really it's about refining the work of the leadership teams that you may already have, one at the district level and one at the school level. So most districts have a DLT or a district leadership team, but let's include the purpose of building a balanced assessment system and serving students well into the purpose of that team. So it's really to prevent issues with implementation and staff buy-in. If you've ever seen the Ambrose change management chart, take a moment and Google that. It shows all the components that go into creating a decision that's going to work really well in a school district. Sometimes I've seen those used within these district and school leadership teams. But you should have 2 different levels, district and school level team. The district level team should include people from the school level, but you're making common district decisions, so district decisions that will be administered across a district. So it's important though to include teacher representation, admin representation, and then always with teams, you want to make sure you're not just including the academic arena, that you are including those that sort of oversee all arenas, including academics, but also behavior and social emotional learning for students. And then at the school level team, you want to make sure that you include leadership and those working directly with students in your schools. So number 2, inventory your current assessments. So I think about this as a closet. We're going in as a team, we've decided we're going to clean out this closet. This is about pulling everything out of your closet and let's just see what we have. So listing the assessment name, what type of assessment is it, if you can give it one of those names that we have defined earlier. When is it given, which area, which grades, and what is its purpose? And sometimes this is where you see the purpose doesn't necessarily align what you called the type. So, but lay it all out there. It doesn't matter how many you have or how messy it looks. Putting it in this chart is going to help get you started with organizing this. So, and this is where you really go through and evaluate, you know, how many do we have? How many purposes are we serving? Are we being redundant and things like that? So then perform a stakeholder analysis. So this is really, is the assessment system that we have in all of those assessments, and are those assessments really meeting the needs of all of the stakeholders in the school district? Your superintendents, your district leaders, your principals and site leaders, your teachers, your parents and guardians, and your students. So we've included in here the decisions and questions that each of those groups really needs to answer and consider. And then we've listed next to it the information and the data needed in order to answer those questions and address those decisions that need to be made. So it's really important that you look at assessment through these lenses to make sure that, number 1, of course, we don't want to over-test, but we want to make sure that a test is meeting the needs of all of our stakeholders. And some districts have gone to the other end of the spectrum and have really reduced the number of tests they're giving to the point where sometimes some of their stakeholder groups aren't getting the information they need. So step number 4, create an alignment map. What does each of these groups need to know from each of these assessments? So you want to make sure that you don't overlook needs of some groups, or you're using the wrong assessment for the wrong need for the wrong group, or giving an assessment that doesn't provide the data you needed in the first place. So that's where you'll want to sort of do this alignment map. You're looking for gaps, redundancies, what are we missing, what do we have too much of? And then determine your specific assessments finally at step 5, and I think some districts jump straight to this step. So this is where now, based on all the analysis we did in steps 1 through 4, step 1 really getting the team together, and then steps 2 through 4 analyzing what we have and whether it's meeting our needs, this is where you actually want to then land the plane a little bit. You want to, now that you've identifying gaps and redundancies, we want to now list out what tool or measurement are we using in each of these areas for each of these purposes. And you may have a different chart for your, 7th grade math needs than you would for your, kindergarten literacy needs, but you want to make sure you have one of those charts for each of those purposes. And then lastly, create your plan. What is the actual name of the assessment we're using? Who is using it? Which grades? Who's going to administer? When is it administered? And then who uploads or enters? This is the kind of data, if you as a leader in a school district could get in the hands of everybody that works with students in your district, you would be surprised the calm that starts to wash over a district. And it really stops that frenzy of we're over-assessing. Because if you go through this process properly, you are not over-assessing. You're getting the right data at the right time in the right hands to make the next best step decision for your students. So let's close it with this. What are some common assessment struggles? These are some of the big ones that stop us from building out these comprehensive assessment systems in school districts. Data siloed, it's living in lots of different places. Your universal screener data lives in a spreadsheet from somewhere. Your interim assessment data lives in a report that was generated and shared out in an email. Your progress monitoring data lives on a clipboard or in a spreadsheet somewhere. So it's about bringing the data back together. So this is an issue that plagues a lot of school districts. If you have an unbalanced or bloated assessment system, bloated's a great word for this. I think it'll resound with a lot of you that are listening. We're testing a lot, but we don't know why, and the data we're garnering isn't driving any action for us. And then expensive, time-consuming assessment systems. We're spending a lot of money and almost more importantly, a lot of time maybe on assessments that we aren't using the data from. So it's important to know exactly why you are giving that assessment, what purpose it serves, and the action that data is going to drive. And then using an assessment for a mismatched purpose. I see this a lot, particularly with interim versus universal screening assessment. Districts will try to cut it down to just one of those assessments because they're periodic. They think, well, let's get rid of one of those fall assessments. Why are we giving 2? And so then the using one assessment for a different purpose just doesn't work very well. It's like putting the wrong fuel in your car. It just doesn't work. Assessment and data literacy is an issue, and getting people up to par on what it means to interpret data, analyze data, use data. I will say I'm a strong believer in this happening though through the work and not on the side of the work. So doing a day-long PV day on assessment literacy and then get back to class and carry on with your life, sometimes they don't integrate very well. So teaching people how to analyze their real data in the moment. In a lot of districts, I applaud them for moving to having a data day where they're actually looking over typically interim assessments together and deciding what they want to do next. And then lack of access to data. We simply just can't find it. We know we've given assessments, but we don't remember the login to get into the system to find the data that we needed, or some data we need has not been generated. And then tools for a formative process are lacking. We don't have the tools. I mentioned entrance tickets. A lot of districts say, how would we even do that? We don't have a tool so that we can gather that data in the moment, have it analyzed and ready to use within seconds so that I can use that data in the classroom with students. And then I think this makes a lot of sense for people, data rich, information poor, or DRIP, which I love that acronym. Lynn, who created the slide deck, didn't come up with that acronym in this slide deck. I love it. So DRIP. We all have this going on in our districts. We have a lot of data, but it's not being analyzed in a way that it's providing useful information for us as a school district. So how about creating your own comprehensive assessment system? We do at Illuminate, we do provide a lot of interoperable solutions. Interoperable is key because school districts use many, many different things, and we applaud you for that. We don't want to stop districts from doing that, but we want to make sure that we are working well in the sandbox with everything school districts use. So we provide interoperable solutions in the area of assessment, including screening, progress monitoring, skills and diagnostic assessments, interim assessments, and then assessment creation and administration tools for you, just-in-time formative assessment tools, classroom summative assessment, common assessment, and then we have a really high quality item bank that we can provide school districts that's standards and DOK aligned and really highly vetted to cover your full spectrum of students. And then we also have services that we can provide to help a district. So we have creation, assessment creation and validation services. If you are interested in hearing more about any of those kinds of services, feel free to reach out to us using the bit.ly, or when you get the slide deck, just click reach out. Thank you so much. And again, watch for an email that is coming to an inbox because you signed up for the webinar. We thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. We really hope that the tools we're providing will help you as a school district. We have a huge passion and commitment at Illuminate Education to provide tools that will first make your lives easier and then make your lives better and more able to reach the needs of your students. But we have to start to address the easier and make things calmer for school districts so that we can help support you in making the work better and richer. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.